He is a health economist whose work broadly focuses on the life force origins of health and socioeconomic inequalities. His work is foundational in that it sort of takes important approaches to causal inference and applying them to population health processes. His work spans both domestic and international contexts and policy settings. Atheen has an MD from Washington University, his PhD in health policy and economics from Yale, and he also completed a residency in internal medicine at MGH. So he has enough degrees to at least keep us entertained for the next 45 minutes. So anyway, please join me in welcoming Atheen here.
So do I stand here? Is that what people usually do? Or okay, awesome. So I'm really excited to present this paper to this group. I would have been excited anyway, but we actually got a reject and resubmit about this paper 5 days ago. So we're looking for feedback and real insight. This is the perfect group to talk about this issue with. So I'll just acknowledge my co-authors, Sonia Balotra, Damian Clark, and Joseph Gomez. We've been on this train with this paper for about 5 years. All right, so that's the breaks with the academic life. I thought actually I would motivate this paper in the way that I might motivate it at the medical school, because it's just a different way of talking about the same problem. And I'm curious what you think about it. So this is data from the World Bank, basically, and as visualized in Our World in Data, a fun website to play with. And this is looking at the maternal mortality ratio, the number of women who die from pregnancy-related causes within 42 days, while pregnant or within 42 days of pregnancy or termination, per 100,000. And this is the United States, and this is Finland, this is 1900. So what you can see is that up until about 1940, there were persistently high rates of maternal mortality in these two countries, with a real drop, and really starting around 1937 in the United States, to where it is currently now, right? So this is the historical context. And what happened here, it was a number of things, better hygiene. Hospitals got safer to have births in as a result of better hygiene and better practices. And sulfa drugs arrived, which reduced the death from puerperal sepsis. There was also better blood banking and all these kinds of things. So these were the technologies that I would say were responsible for what is a very dramatic decrease in maternal mortality over a period of really 25 years. If you look at the rest of the world today, on average, right, and this includes these two countries, on average we are at about over 200 deaths per 100,000, which is roughly where the United States was in the early 1940s on the eve of penicillin becoming available. And if you look in sub-Saharan Africa, we are actually where the United States was just at the time of the sulfa era, right? So there remain, I think, huge disparities in maternal mortality. I will suggest to you that the decline in maternal mortality, to the extent that we can measure it or even accurately understand it, is slower than the similar decline in child mortality or even like HIV/AIDS. So we are making progress, but it's not as fast as some of the other classes of diseases and age groups that we've been working through. I did that physically, but there's a line that I had put in there for you to see easily. Okay. So why are maternal mortality rates so high? I think the way we think about it in medicine and the way that very rich people like Bill Gates think about it is that this is a resource problem. And what kind of resources? Well, access to health clinics, skilled attendants, obstetric services, antibiotics, and then onward referral for complicated cases, right? Like we think these are things that are not happening. And that is actually correct. But what I'll suggest to you is that these are technologies that we've had since like the late 1930s, 1940s at least, right? Like, so this is an 80-year-old problem. We know how to do this. We've done it. We just haven't done it all over the world. So we started thinking about this as what are the barriers to adoption? So in the medicine literature, there's a really famous essay in the New England Journal of Medicine by Bernadine Healy, and this is from the early 1990s. And this was about cardiovascular diseases. And she talks about cardiovascular diseases, Dr. Healy, through this parable about a woman that had to disguise herself as a man in order to gain education and study the Torah. And effectively what her point was that here's a set of diseases that we're not thinking about because of the constituency it affects. we're not really spending a lot of time talking about women-specific diseases because it's our blind spot, and as a result, we have these huge disparities, or we have an under-recognized problem. And it was actually a really big deal. So even today, we talk about how clinical trials for cardiovascular medicine, for example, do not represent women the same way that they represent men, and maybe we should have separate clinical trials by biological sex. So influential essay, and our thought with this was, what if this is what's happening to maternal mortality? It's affecting a constituency that is not prioritized in many domains of life, and as a result, here's a problem that we haven't really been paying a lot of attention to, which is all the more tragic because the technology to deal with it is old. Okay. So I'm going to seg into talking a little bit about the political impacts of women in decision-making roles. So starting here onwards, like, you should just interrupt me. You can raise your hand or you can just call out. We need all the help we can get with the paper. So if I don't hear from you, then I'll feel sad. And I'll do this lit review a little differently in that I'm not going to name all the papers, but I'm just kind of tell you a story of why we think, why we started studying this particular question. So the reason to look at women in decision-making roles is potentially, here's a way to give a voice to a constituency that didn't have one, right? That's where we're going with this. So this is a paper from 2006 looking at a few Latin American countries and talking to women and men legislators in these countries about their preferences and the way they value specific issues, including women's equality and children and family issues. And these light bars are women legislators, and these darker bars are men. So what you can see is for these issues, women's equality and children and family, you see that the distribution of prioritization, where this is very high priority and this is very low priority, is shifted rightwards for women. So these are issues that ostensibly women care more about than men, even conditional on the fact that men and women legislators care equally about the economy, for example. So there does seem to be different preferences by gender among legislators for specific policy issues. That's the first place to start. This difference in preferences will show up, or has shown up, in the way women legislators and policymakers make decisions. So there's this famous paper by Chattopadhyay and Duflo, that's an extra H that shouldn't be there, looking at the basically random assignment of women legislators at the village level in India, and looking at what kind of public good investments were made as a result. So villages that were randomly assigned to a women head legislator, or to a head women head, had much more investment in public goods such as drinking water, schools, and roads, things that are important for health, right? My colleague Sonia has a paper using a regression discontinuity design on the closeness of an election to basically show that being on the margin of electing a woman MP leads to greater investment in antenatal services and nutrition. There's also some research that looks at investments in public health expenditure as a whole. Clayton Zetterberg is a great example. And basically you see that there's more expense on these particular goods, which tracks with the fact that there's more investment in each specific domain as well. And then there's also more enactment of laws that codify maternal and child health issues in a legal fashion. And this is this is a local paper, right? I haven't met this gentleman yet, but we have corresponded over email. But it's a very interesting paper that's under review. Is he here, by any chance? Hey, thank you for sending me that. All right. So different preferences, different investments. How does it happen? So there's a couple of really interesting new big data case studies that take text of proceedings in government in France and in Germany, these two papers, and do like natural language processing to understand how much time is spent talking on different issues. Like, these are really fascinating papers. So Lippmann has shown through looking at lots and lots of text that women policymakers are more likely to initiate women-related amendments. And Bhaskar and Hassami have this paper, which is fantastic because they actually have the time spent discussing specific issues. And they show that when there's each additional women legislator, or actually when you go from having no or few women in a group to having an additional legislator, the time spent on discussing women-related issues grows up. And that impact of an additional woman legislator is actually strongest when the pre-existing share of women in the government is low. So it's a really cool paper, but basically it's saying, it's getting into the nuts and bolts of how having even a single woman in government can change the conversation that's happening. These are, of course, in developed countries. We're going to be spending our time looking at developing countries, but nevertheless, I thought this is probably the state of the art of the research on this political economy piece. And does this translate into health outcomes? So we've talked about preferences, investments, now what's happening downstream. So there's some very, very good descriptive studies in different settings showing real impacts on infant and child health. There's very strong associations. There's a paper in demography that also looked at maternal mortality, showing that as the share of women legislators go up, there is a concomitant reduction in maternal mortality, again, using a descriptive model. And then trying to go dig a little bit deeper into causal inference, Sonia and her colleagues have done a paper looking at this regression discontinuity design in India and showing that just being on the margin of electing a woman MP does help improve neonatal health through reducing neonatal mortality. So that's kind of the evidence we have so far. So this is where we jump in with this paper. I'm going to suggest that we're going to investigate the causal relationship between women's political participation in maternal mortality. So we're going to move away from that description to try to give you a causal estimate that, we'll see if you think is credible or not. To do this, we're going to focus on parliamentary gender quotas, the adoption of these quotas at the country year level as a natural experiment. And that's the mechanical reason to do this. The functional reason that we're interested in this, though, is that we would love to see what are the consequences of these policies in general. So more than just being a nice identification strategy, maybe, we think it's actually really important to look at the impacts of quotas going forward. And we're going to try to get an underlying mechanism. So what I will tell you is the reject and resubmit dinged us on the mechanisms thing because they think we're showing too much of a black box. So I'm curious to see how you think we can improve that if we can at all. So the relationship that we're going to look at, this is just descriptive in the data, 1990 to 2015, that's our study period. The red is the share of women in parliament. So on average, going from about 10% doubling to 20%. Over the study period. And in this dashed blue line is the maternal mortality ratio in logs, right? So they're going in different directions. Is there a causal relationship between these two? Sure. This graph, this is the world. Yeah. National level. Okay, so here's one problem. If you have a chronically understudied issue for whatever reason, maybe the constituency it affects, the measurement of that problem, it's not happening, right? So the blind spot is not just in not doing something about maternal mortality, it's just that we have no idea what it is, right? In the United States, our first measure of maternal mortality came out 3 weeks ago or something, since 2014, right? This was from the CDC, and they developed this whole new method of capturing maternal deaths, and now there's some suggestion that it's actually wrong. So if you're not paying attention, you're not measuring it. So that gives us a huge problem, which is how can we credibly study this question? We're going to try to do this in two different ways. We're going to lean heavily on the United Nations Mortality Interagency Group estimates from 1990 to 2015. They basically are using a number of Bayesian modeling techniques to try to back out what maternal mortality rates are. And what they try to do is address the systematic underreporting of maternal deaths. So they're going to build those estimates up from whatever terrible vital statistics there are, and then bolster that with survey data and other things, right? So these data are great. I think they've given us a window into the problem that we haven't had. But the point of fact is that they are modeled, which introduces two issues. One is that we have no idea how good the modeling is. Actually, three issues. The second issue is that is the modeling dependent on parameters that might be related to the exposure? And three, there's a probability or there's a sampling distribution around the modeled estimates, and we have to deal with that uncertainty. So we're going to try to address all of those things. Because this is not a perfect solution, for all the reasons I said, we're actually going to look at the DHS as well. So the DHS, you guys all know what the DHS is, but in about 44 countries that we're able to look at, in low and middle income countries, respondents as part of this sisterhood method module are asked about their sisters and whether they died in or of childbirth, right? So we're going to use that to basically construct our own panel of maternal mortality rates for the same study period. We don't have a lot of surveys to work with here. It's a very different sample. The estimates are going to be noisier, but our whole point is trying to see whether the estimates that we get from the DHS qualitatively match up with what we get from these modeled estimates. So that's our solution thus far. If you have any other ideas on how to do this, I would love to hear it. But this was the first big roadblock that we ran into. Yeah, for this one. Yeah. I will say that some of the inputs into this from the DHS. So if they're wildly different, I mean, I think we would feel worried about that a little bit, but they end up not being. Okay, so our method for causal inference, and I put this here, that's the title, but honestly, the gender quotas are important intrinsically, so this isn't just like an identification strategy. It's important to understand the effects of these policies more generally, is these parliamentary gender quotas. So I'll talk a little bit about that. So in 1990, as part of the UN Fourth World Congress, there was a suggestion that as part of a new agenda for women's empowerment, that parliamentary seats up to 30% should be reserved for women in all countries. And this, I think, really came about, this particular declaration came about as a result of a number of years of increasing activism and recognition around the importance of women's rights, and that having decision-making roles is important to actually guarantee those rights, what we talked about before. And I think it's all the more important. There's this great paper by Dawn Teal, who I didn't realize at Penn. She's a political scientist. But it basically talks about why aren't there more women in government, using the US as a case study. And she actually traces through a bunch of survey data. Like, they asked people at various decades in the United States, would you be okay with a woman president, woman senator, whatever it is? And people say yes. But operationally, that's not what happened, right? And part of it is that there are many other structural biases. For example, expectations culturally about how women should be spending their time, that both reduce the pipeline of women policymakers and potentially at the voting booth may change on the margin the way people decide. So even if you don't have explicit discrimination, there can still be a structural bias that leads to the outcomes we see. And so this type of quota system, in some sense, is meant to deal with that, right? It's an affirmative action policy, is one way to think of it. So 22 countries took this on. So between 1995 and about, I think, 2012 in our data set, they implemented constitutionally protected quotas, reserving some number of seats for parliament. Now, they didn't go the full 30%. Some did. Some said 5%. So there's a little bit of heterogeneity, and we'll use that in our analyses. But 22 countries took it on. There's also another set of policies that countries also took on, and these are basically mandating that when you have a set of candidates for a particular seat, that X number or X percentage of those candidates should be women. This was mostly in Latin America. These are called candidate quotas. We'll talk about them later. They were less effective in actually producing a woman policymaker than a quota was, and I think it's obvious why that might be the case. So I'll tell you our natural experiment design, but it's important for that to understand why quotas happen. So we went to the political science. So, ultimately we're going to compare places that adopted a quota and the change in maternal mortality rates to places that didn't, right? That we think ostensibly conditional on country and year fixed effects are similar places. But the adoption of quota is a choice. And so you really have to understand that choice to be able to make this argument. And so we looked at, there's really a lot of case studies on this for different countries. And what we got from those case studies were places that already had evolving norms of equality. They already had better economic rights for women, where there was pressure from international organizations, tended to be the ones that adopted these quotas. So I have a link here if you want to see it. But basically what we did was we empirically tried to show that that was the case by getting data on proxies for all these different measures. And we can see actually that, yes, lagged measures of women's equality predict the adoption of quota in a given year. And it's the economic measures that do it the best. And pressure from international organizations, we have developmental assistance for aid, but we also have the percentage of UN peacekeepers, which is suggested as like, that's one way to have international pressure is to have an army from other places in your country. And those things actually predict the adoption of quota. The R squared on that regression is like 0.05. So all those measures maybe predict 5%. So there is a lot of unobservable stuff that we don't have. And so in a few slides, I'll tell you how we try to deal with the fact. But this is the biggest threat to inference, is that we don't know why these people chose to do it and what other countries did. Okay, so adoption of quotas. I told you there's 3 different styles of quotas, right? So here's the United States. That color means no legislative quota. Here's Mexico, that has this candidate list quota, meaning you have to have women candidates, but doesn't necessarily guarantee that they win the office. And then this lighter shade of brown or tan or whatever that is, right here is the reserved seats. And you can see that there are a number of countries, predominantly in Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and prominently China, that pass these reserved seat quotas. So there's a interesting geographic distribution. And Latin America, which we talked about just like an hour ago, those countries are all passing these like candidate list quotas. And here's the time path of when quotas were adopted. So this is our study period. And the first country starts adopting in 96, 97. You have a huge uptick in adoption basically between 2000 and maybe 2008. And then there's a couple countries at the end. Again, a lot of the mass is in Sub-Saharan Africa as far as the number of countries. But here's how the distribution works. So this is the variation that we're going to use for our quasi-experiment, right? There's country year variation in the timing of the adoption of quotas. Okay. So here's how we're going to do this. This is unnecessarily complex, but just to kind of orient you, what we're basically going to do is we're going to look at 2 sets of countries, places that implemented quotas versus places that didn't. And we're going to look at the difference in maternal mortality between pre and post that event in these 2 sets of countries. And we're going to do it flexibly. So we're going to align all the countries to time 0. And then we're going to see from at each time since the quota was passed and before the quota was passed, each annual increment, what was the relative difference in maternal mortality compared to the reference period, which is just before the quotas went into effect, right? So we're going to line everyone up at time 0. And in the econ literature is calling this now an event study specification, which has, if you look it up, it has a very specific meaning in finance, which is not this. But all this is basically saying is that this is it's just a flexible difference in difference model, right? We're allowing the treatment effect to change over time. And so we'll estimate a number of leads, which is all the pre-years before a policy goes into effect, and a number of lags, which is all the post years. And we'll do this from like -10 to 10 plus years. That's the basic machinery of what we do. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So they're gonna, for each of, so this is a dummy variable for each negative increment, positive. So they will get zeros for all of these dummies, but we will identify the secular trends in those countries with time fixed effects. So we have a fixed effect for calendar year. And so they're there to basically identify the calendar fixed effects. That's the job they're doing. And then we have fixed effects for the country as well. So conditional on any time invariant factors within a country and secular global trends in both the exposure and the outcome, we're trying to see if is there a differential trajectory at the time of quota implementation when the quota is implemented. Okay. So we do a number of things that the usual suspect kind of stuff. We cluster the standard errors at the county level. We have some, in the specification we submitted to the journal, we have GDP and democracy controls in there. This is the Polity 4 index. The reviewer told us to take those out. I will tell you that it doesn't matter what covariates are in there, and I'll get to that a little later, but it's a pretty simple machinery. I just thought this is a good time to talk about difference in difference. So you may have seen the way people typically do this or have done this is you'll have a dummy variable that goes from 0 to 1 the year that a quota turns on, and that will be like the exposure measure that you use. So it's kind of this, it's just a very simple single coefficient to describe what is the average change in the outcome pre and post relative to people that didn't experience that change. It turns out that there's, it's not, when your treatment effect varies over time, and the timing of treatment, like so countries are doing this at different times, varies as well, that might actually give you a biased answer. And the reason is this. So if you have a number of countries that are sort of turning on at different times, at certain points, those countries are in the control group for a set of countries that are treated later, and they may be in the treatment group themselves, and their comparisons change over time. So Andrew Goodman Bacon has a great paper. This is just for the grad students in here, and actually in everyone else too. But you can think about, in our case, right, 22 countries passed quotas. There's a bunch of countries that didn't. So one comparison that's in there is those 22 countries against all the other countries that are there. It also turns out, though, that, so that's this, right? You have some countries that are treated early, some countries that are treated late, but they're all being compared against places that did not have the policy. But these early and late groups can actually serve as controls for each other, right? And this is where you run into the problem. Because if it turns out that your treatment effect isn't like a level shift like this, but instead is increasing over time, your control group could be something that's already changing in a way that is not actually a proper control group. And so that's the worry. And so if your treatment effect is dynamic like this, meaning changes, it's either upward increasing or downward increasing or has some funny shape, you're going to get some very odd results that don't necessarily speak to the actual effect of the policy. So that's why we do this whole event study thing, because it's relatively flexible and we can see the shape of the treatment effects over time. So the only thing, okay, there's one table, but everything else is going to be graphs for this reason. Okay. With me so far, any questions? All right. So threats to inference, right? So we already kind of talked about this, but the adoption of quotas is a choice. It's a choice that could be correlated with all the investments that you're making that may make the world a better place for childbirth, right? And we want to say it's actually because of quotas and not because of those third things. So there's a couple ways we can try to address this issue. One is that the event study is nice because you're estimating a coefficient for every period before that policy actually happens. If it's true that places that were adopting quotas were also becoming better societies for women in general, you might actually see that maternal mortality relative in these quota adopting countries relative to those that didn't was already declining prior to the policy. So there's a whole other literature on difference and difference now, which is like, can you actually use null hypothesis testing to test for pretrends? It turns out probably not, but in any case, for the purpose of this talk, we're just going to look at it visually. Do you see something weird happening before the policy even goes into place? If the answer is yes, then it's a clue that maybe what you think is a relationship is actually confounded by something else. So that's parallel trends assumption. You might have heard of it that way. The other thing we can do is we can adjust for predictors of quota uptake. This is the stuff that I talked about, like what are the things that predicted why some countries did this and others didn't. This is what we did in the older version of the paper, and this is why I have it here, just to be true to what we did. But I think in retrospect, because the R squared of that prediction model of who developed quotas was so low, that probably our measures of why people adopted quotas are incomplete and noisy. So if you have a noisy measure as an explainer, it's probably better to put it on the left-hand side and use it as a balance test than it is to use it as a covariate, right? So I'll tell you that we've adjusted for all this stuff. It doesn't change the answer, but that might not mean anything to you because maybe they're just bad predictors, right? So the other thing we'll do is we'll just kind of assume that we don't know what the world looks like. We can't measure these like funny things that may have happened. But we can try to put some bounds on our estimates using this is a method by Conley that applies to instrumental variables. But the idea is like, we don't know what's actually happening, but let's see under weak assumptions that we can make about what the confounding is, can we develop a bound on the estimate? And does that bound actually not cross zero? If the bound is on one side of zero, then we can say, okay, like even under like a pretty broad class of confounding, we still see this relationship. So that's something we do too. And then we do some dose response stuff. So we look at whether those people who did 5% versus 20 to 30% for their quotas actually had different effects on maternal mortality. Most of the political science literature suggests that there's some strength in numbers, so we would expect those effects to be bigger in places that had bigger quotas. And we also look at the candidate list quotas, which are not as effective. We wouldn't expect to see as big an effect on maternal mortality there. And the idea really behind these is that on the extensive margin, if you're passing any kind of quota, maybe whatever the unobserved reasons that you're doing that are consequential for health are similar across different types of quotas. And so, if that's the case, that they're similar, we should really only see the effect where the quotas are strong. It's a strong assumption because maybe, if you're doing a 5% quota versus a 30% quota, maybe you're only 5% invested in women's equality versus 30 or whatever it is. And so the unobservables are also moving in the same direction, but that's our thought. Please. Yeah.
You might need to have more than 30% getting the effect.
Yeah.
You don't know what the range is.
Yeah. That's right. So we actually don't know. We don't know if there's a threshold effect. When we did this, that was actually what we were testing for. It seems to be linear, relatively linear in the size of the quota, but that's a fair point. It looks like from Bhaskaran, from their work in Germany, that it was only a few that could move the needle on the type of conversation. So it was one of those things where everyone cared about the issue, but it just didn't come up, and you just required enough voices to make it come up. So that would suggest a low threshold, but it could be that in some of these national parliaments, it's a different set of dynamics. So that's a point well taken. Okay. And then there's endogenous measurements. So there's two things. We use this DHS measure, and then we account for the uncertainty. And all of this is, one thing I didn't quite say right is that if you have women in government now and you start caring about the issue, you might just be better at measuring it, and you might find a lot of cases that you never found before. I will suggest to you that bias will actually work against us. And that's all we say about it in the paper, because we can't do much more about it. Okay, so let me show you some results. With like very confident declarative titles. We'll see what you think. Okay, so quotas raised women's participation. So this is our event study, okay? Here's the time from reform. These are each of the annual increments before, that's what this vertical line is, and after policy implementation. This is the coefficient on the share of women in parliament, which we've multiplied by 100, so you can interpret it as a percentage point change. And these, so here's the reference point, which is time -1, so post, pre, and each of these diamonds reflect the relative estimate, the relative difference in the trend between places that passed a quota versus those that didn't. So the first thing I will say is that prior to quota implementation, these places are more or less noisily following a very, very similar trend. The event study confidence intervals fan out as you go further in time, which makes sense because you have fewer observations out there. But once the quota goes into effect, you actually see that they work pretty immediately. This jives with qualitative accounts. So on average, if you look across all these coefficients, it's about a 5 to 6 percentage point increase in the share of women in parliament. And it works out to about a 36% increase total. So we're starting with a low number of women in parliament. You increase it by 5 percentage points, you actually get a relatively large percent bump. So just remember this is the first stage in some sense, right? So the quotas worked. That's all we wanted to show. So this is what maternal mortality looks like, right? So here, this is the log of maternal deaths per 100,000. It's the same x-axis, and this is splitting post and pre. So prior to the policy, you basically don't see a lot of difference in the trend between these two types of countries. And then once the policy goes into effect, you see a pretty clear negative, and probably through year 8, increasing treatment effect on maternal mortality. So here's the reason not to use the standard diff and diff, right? Because if you have some of these controls, countries acting as controls for each other that have been treated, you're actually going to underestimate your true effect because they're already declining, and you're not attributing that decline to the policy. So this is actually the whole thing. So if you wanted to walk out, this would be the time. But effectively, we're saying that passing a quota by 8 years out, it's a 16% decrease in maternal mortality rates in this endemic measure. So I'll stop there for questions and I can keep going, but this is the main thing. So this is what I'll tell you for reviewers is that they love this picture. They're like, we believe, but then they want 100 other things, and that's what you can help me with. But you may not believe this, and if you're thinking about it, or if you have any questions or concerns, like either tell me. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, right. Yeah. So not individually, but what we did was we have region by year fixed effects. So we allow every region to flexibly have its own secular trend, and the event study looks just like this. Yeah, that's right. We even stratified by the baseline level of maternal mortality. It is. So there is convergence by that level. Yeah. But the region year fixed effects in some sense take it out. Was there someone else? Okay, I just should show you the standard diff and diff estimates. So like I said, if you average across those event study coefficients, you're getting 5 to 6 percentage points. That's about what you get. And then for maternal mortality ratio, it's actually, the average is saying it's about 10 to 15%, something like that, depending on whether you exclude India and China or if you weight by population. We did this every which way. That's actually not that bad. And it turns out the Goodman-Bacon paper I told you about diff and diff with time-varying treatment has this whole decomposition part to try and understand which of those 4 comparisons are driving it. And it turns out 96% of what's driving our effect is this treated versus completely untreated comparison. So that actually is the reason why the diff and diff coefficients look pretty good for us here. But in any case, if you wanted to see it in table form, that's what it looks like. So we actually had high income countries in there, which could be a little odd because they could be both skewing the pre-trends and they're an odd comparison group. If you take them out, it looks, again, pretty similar. And so I think in our main specification, when we resubmit, we'll probably just remove the high income countries. I don't know. So this is what the estimates look like from the DHS. We bin them in 2-year increments because we just don't have as many countries. It's a totally different sample of countries. And we have to account for the uncertainty in these estimates and this confidence interval. So things get pretty large in terms of that uncertainty fast. But the pattern, I think, is relatively similar. It's not as striking, but I think it's there. I will tell you that the average effect that's implied here is like a 25% decline, which is maybe double what we were finding in the other sample. And that seems to be purely because of the sample of countries that we have in the DHS. It's possible that some of it is that the MMIG estimates are actually not capturing the underreporting of maternal deaths, and that the DHS estimates might be doing better. That could be another reason we find a bigger estimate. But we just sort of leave it here to say that it's large, not implausibly so, and qualitatively it looks like what we found in the other set of estimates. So we did lots of additional checks. I think, this is an old slide. So I believe half of these now, having seen the reviewer comments, that's just how it goes. I think the region year fixed effects, that was new actually. I think that is very important and probably maybe should be in the main model for the reasons you suggested. Putting in the determinants of quota adoption, not surprising, it doesn't change the estimates, but maybe it's because these are not the best measures, even though we tried as hard as we could. The IV bounds are awesome. So what we did was we used quotas as an instrumental variable for for political participation, women in parliament, and then looked at the coefficient on women in parliament from that IV model on maternal mortality. And then we basically did this exercise. It's just like, how much do you have to dial up the potential confounding to be to reverse the estimate? Basically, you have to dial it up in a way that's like completely implausible, like maybe 2 to 3 times greater than the correlation between women's education and maternal mortality for it to make a difference. So we feel like the bounds, at least in this case, are helping us. Estimates are rising in quota size. We talked about that, but those places that are doing 20 to 30% versus 0 to 5 or 5 to 10%, they're getting more bang for their buck, so to speak. Again, from these follow-on effects. And when we look at these candidate list quota regimes, there's no real effects being found. Part of it is that they don't actually do anything for women in parliament in the same way that these actual reserve seats do. And part of it is that they're in Latin America and that the baseline mortality rate in Latin America is lower than in sub-Saharan Africa. So some of that is we're actually seeing this convergence piece. Yeah. Yeah, so
data on maternal mortality might have changed under the Q, but
Yeah.
But could that have an effect on the human rate?
Yes. I think if the data on maternal mortality are better, our ex ante hypothesis is that it's being undermeasured. So I think you would find new cases, kind of like what happened in the United States. If that's the case, we would think that the maternal mortality rate that bias would go in the other direction. We think that the DHS helps us against that, recall issues and all, but it's an open question. We just, what would be great is if we could simulate that, if we knew how much bias there was, like if there was a regime where they went from actually recording this to not. The United States might actually be the best example, although the baseline rates are so relatively low compared to these countries. But to the extent, it's like I think we found 20% more cases, and now they're saying that there's maybe 30% more cases than we found. So that's like a potentially pretty large if you scale that up. And that bias would be attenuating, which actually could explain the entire difference, if I think about it, between the DHS and the MMIG estimates.
I agree with you. It's very reasonable. Could you check directly, not in terms of the numbers, but to see whether the countries that adopted quotas, what the changes they made were of resources, and specifically whether they changed the method?
Oh yeah, okay. So that's what I want to get to. I have, 10 minutes? Oh, okay, great. Yeah, you can so keep asking the Qs. I will provide the As, and let's just keep going. So that's actually what we got dinged on the most. So we thought we had done pretty well with this, but it turns out not well enough. So let's look at potential mechanisms. One is, let's look at those investments that should have been made 80 years ago or whatever that haven't been made. So one is antenatal care. The other is the share of births that were attended by a skilled birth attendant. So these are the event studies for those. I'm sorry, I made them too small. I should have put them on different graphs. But if you can see them, you basically see this inverse pattern, right? So their antenatal care share is increasing over time since the time of reform. And then you see a much more dramatic increase for the share of attended births. One thing that's a little weird is, these are relatively small increases in the first few years relative to the decline in maternal mortality that we saw. So it's hard to make a lot out of a few coefficients that have wide confidence intervals. But it does look like the inputs are changing in the same way that maternal mortality did. To the extent that this fully can explain the effect, we're not sure. Some of these are from the World Bank. Some of these we put together from DHS. Yeah. Yeah, so just make sure that's the case. So that's one set of mechanisms. We can do that. Another set of mechanisms we could look at is healthcare spending. Here, unfortunately, this is healthcare spending as a share of GDP, and we looked at the denominator. The GDP does not change. It neither goes up or down as a result of quotas. So if we look at healthcare spending as a whole, as a share of that, we do see that there is an increase, and it's happening relatively quickly. But these estimates are pretty noisy. So possibly something going with spending as a whole, which may include on goods other than attended births and, or inputs other than attended births and, skilled birth attendant or antenatal care. But, so possibly this is a expenditure story, then that would be consistent with other papers. The other thing we looked at is, are having women in parliament, are they better or does it make the parliament better at getting money from Bill Gates or something? So this is development assistance for maternal health, and we actually don't see any change there. And that seems to fit with the political economy of how those donor decisions are made. So we look at something we call women's empowerment. We don't actually have a good measure of fertility. That's probably what we would want to do next. And we also want to look at intimate partner violence just to try to get a sense of what's going on in the household, and would that potentially put people at risk. But if we look at birth rates, we do see a pre-trend in these in this. It's a non-statistically significant but visually obvious pre-trend. Nevertheless, there seems to be a trend break. There are fewer births in these areas where there's women in parliament. And if you look at women's schooling, this is for 15 to 19-year-olds who soon will often go on to become mothers, you do see like this increase in women's schooling that happens after women are in parliament. You actually see an increase in men's schooling too. So it's not just there's investment in one gender.
So if there are like less births, there are like more resources for each woman.
Yeah.
That's
We think the birth part could be
like, because it,
yeah.
Have you thought more about whether women get pregnant later in life that may have more risk of maternal mortality?
Yeah.
So maybe a pattern of fertility rather than mortality.
Age of first birth or not?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because the birth rates also, I don't know how they calculate it, but there's a change in age distribution within some of these families and maybe, so they might receive that as an artifact
Right.
of having all the people.
Right.
You know, you would want to get some other measure of something.
So I think-
BMR or something.
If we could get an age specific birth rate like for like a 5-year bin or yeah. Yeah, that's probably where we'll go for more. Yeah. We can do that. I mean, I think that critique came up, which is like there's many black boxes, but to open up this one, like how much of it is the age distribution, you know, number of births, all of that. So we definitely plan to do it. I think though, so that's all we did for the mechanisms. We had 6 things that we could measure, but I think the issue was they wanted to look at things like laws. So we're trying to find cross-country databases or even a single country case study where we could look at what types of laws are being passed. We tried to lean on the political science literature. Actually, we didn't have some of the papers I put in here in the paper we submitted. So part of our response will be to bulk up that section of how this would work if they're women policymakers. But we're trying to find databases on laws around reproductive rights or women's health, maternal health, to kind of bolster. You know, I think their issue is not even that we've done these mechanisms. It's more that how do you even go from a women policymaker to more antenatal care, right? Like that's the link that they're pushing us on.
Yeah, and you know, even antenatal care, you know, the timing is sort of different.
It is different. Yep.
I wonder if you can investigate degree of representation, or maybe you know, you're picking on passing these quotas, but maybe if you have the percent in parliament, there might be some thresholds where you know women, you know, they can investigate, you know, jumping from 20 to 30. That's really what produces, and connecting more directly to actually, because you have these quotas, but you have suddenly you have 10 women in parliament. It's hard to imagine they're going to affect legislation. Or maybe we actually focus on a certain level of representation. It might line up.
Yeah, we can do that. Yeah, because we have all that data.
Okay, yeah. So maybe there's it happens when it jumps from from 20 to 30 or something, when they actually have a voting.
Yeah.
In terms of the law, the UN may have collect some of these things.
Yeah.
So are you an FDA or the population? I think they're not that well, but they're all.
Yeah.
Don might be a very good resource for that as well. Don Teeley, who's at the political science here, he has lots of data sets on laws, so she might be a good person. But I had a couple of other comments.
Yeah.
So I had, so this was great. I think this paper is super interesting and super well done. One I had like a conceptual comment, and the other one is whatever, most of the logical things continuing what you're saying. So the conceptual one, I really like how you motivate the paper. But I guess I want to sort of like add a qualification on describing the whole story of like how exactly women in parliament would be affecting, you know, like changing the political environment for women's health. And like the story that you told us is a little bit consistent with kind of like essentializing women to like specific priorities that are essentially different from men. And that's to one extent true, but it's also not the whole story, right? Like you can have like women conservative who are like passing the most powerful laws for reproductive health as well. So I think I get that narrative, but I think it would also be good to kind of qualify it in the sense that the passing of quotas to me seems more like a proxy for a change of political environment for gender questions, and just in addition to a shift in the number of women places. So, and I understand that putting it that way, that the quotas doesn't work as well as like a perfect causal inference answer, but I think you can still make it work. So I think that would be nice to add some qualification there. And this is the conceptual piece. And then for methods, I was wondering if you considered this synthetic control. Yeah, so you probably already done some of that. And I was thinking that, yeah, some of the synthetic controls basically allow you to do some placebo tests, or like you change the timing of the quotas, and then if you still see the effect or not. But I guess, yeah, some you thought about it.
Yeah, the synthetic control is a great idea. I think we just didn't have enough donor units because it's like 154 countries. So it would be hard, I think, to do a synthetic. Like we could do it for some of the countries and not others, and maybe that's enough to show that, like, at least for these 10 where we can stably find a good donor pool that kind of looks like this, that we find X, Y, Z. I think that's not a bad idea. We did it 2 or 3 years ago, and then we kind of left it behind, but it's a good thought. Yeah, I mean, they're more like into the weeds about, you know, the difference in difference. Now everyone's like, the hot thing is to talk about the whole diversion that I went to, which is like, did you do these weights? Did you do this? What's driving the effect? What's not? So we're going down that route. But a synthetic control would ostensibly, if you do it for each country, you would see it right there, in the same way that you would see through all this fancy stuff. So I think that's a great thought. And on your conceptual point, in the paper, we should spend more time on this, but we allow for a channel to be the fact that this is, having women in government is just empowering for people in general, even independent of a policy channel. So that's the Beeman et al. Paper in Science, which shows that like the aspirations for young girls in like Indian villages rose just because there was a woman policymaker, even absent of whatever investments they were making. So, I mean, that alone, I think, you know, it's possible that this is a bargaining power story. It's like people feel empowered to get antenatal care or something like that. And right. And then that's what the education is. And so we thought that's why looking at something like intimate partner violence, which is of course an extreme, you know, if you talk to the economists, like an extreme way of thinking about an intra-household bargaining position. But if we adopt that economic model, which isn't always the best, but if we at least start there and adopt it, you know, do we see something like that happening with intimate partner violence too? And maybe that's a policy related piece, but I think it also speaks to the potential for empowerment. So we are thinking on that channel. And I think that's a really important point. For the purposes of a reject and resubmit or an R&R or whatever, it's not, for the purposes of something like that, I think it's also good because possibly we are not going to be able to get the mechanism down to the weeds in the way that they want. But looking for threshold effects, which maybe we can tie to a political science type model, and then looking at more of these empowerment outcomes, I think is really critical. So the point is well taken.
The legislation piece, it could be like a nice mechanism, but like you would not see that immediately very effectively. I mean, the times of the political process are like so different. So like the empowerment mechanism that actually line up better for
Yes.
So we're trying to just think about how you can actually prove
Yeah.
I think it's very, very interesting.
Oh no, it's funny. The reviewers do too. Every editor is like, yeah, that figure, we believe it now. So it's a kind of these interesting thing. But I think as much as that's a little annoying, I think it is important though, because we have a chance to do this in a way that ideally you want the mechanism, right? Because, for many reasons, not just for science reasons, but for policy reasons, I think the more I've talked to policymakers, the more they want to know why rather than just what. And so we're taking this as an opportunity to like really improve the paper. So all of this is incredibly helpful. Yeah.
Piggyback off of Pilar's comment as well about the gender essentialism kind of issue. So I recently saw a presentation that was really interesting by someone named Alexander Lee, who's a political scientist. And he finds that in Mumbai, once they implement these kind of quotas in Mumbai legislature, they find that these women are more receptive to to all the like infrastructure issues and basically do their job better than men do. But what they find is that the mechanism through which that happens isn't necessarily because women have different priorities, but actually because women in these contexts are excluded from a lot of the party politics. So while the male legislators are out there, doing some underhand dealings to get money for the party and try to get reelected and all these things, a lot of these women don't get reelected. They serve one term. They serve one term because every year the thing turns over and then their seat is no longer reserved for women, so it basically goes back to a man.
Okay.
So as a result, they're less embroiled in some of these party politicking that leads them to actually just do their job. So I just wonder if one way that this might be happening is just some of these sort of party politics things happening, or even the fact that once women get into a legislature, they get put on some family and women committee or something because people think that, and just being a woman and on that committee, you just make better decisions than a bunch of men used to make when they were on that committee. And it doesn't necessarily reflect that your priorities are different. It also means that it could be working through a bunch of mechanisms. So I'm just saying that it may not always function through priorities so much as it just functions through the fact that women, when on a committee to discuss reproductive health, are like, oh, I know about this because I also, experienced these things, whereas men didn't. Or also because of certain ways that the political parties are running and the way that women don't have access to other spaces, right? Like she may not have, even if she cares a lot about the military, she may not have access to those aspects of legislating because she may be excluded from those spaces. So that's just another mechanism through which it might be happening.
So you said Alexander Lee was the paper? I'll check it out. That's great. That is a mechanism that we had not thought about. But if we were to lay it out as a theory, that would be in there. In addition to direct policy making and maybe raising aspirations and through other channels, just more efficient policy making on the basis of expected return or whatever it is, or where people are placed, I think is a really critical thing. So thank you. Yeah, that's great. That was published, this Lee paper? Oh yeah, I know what that's like. I'll check that out. Thank you. Yeah.
I totally echo what people have said that I have finding. I wonder in terms of thinking about the mechanisms, and again, I don't know if you can do it in this paper or if it's sort of like a separate line of inquiry, is to look at who's experienced the greatest relative drops in maternal mortality within countries, right? Because I think that will give you some clues in terms of the mechanisms. If you're thinking about it from a legislation perspective, if it's sort of like a targeted policy or more of a universal benefit, like I'm thinking about, targeted legislation to increase women's access, low-income women's access to prenatal care and antenatal care versus universal investments in women's schooling and economic outcomes, right? So just trying to think about within countries who it is, where we're seeing the biggest relative drop might also provide some clues.
Yeah, I think we could do that with the DHS very credibly. And that's a great thought. We touched on this and not in the way that you said, by looking at infant mortality for boys and girls and showing that actually things improve for both genders at the infant level. And that for women and men schooling in this late adolescent, early adulthood period, you saw things improve for both as well. So there's just some universality across gender. Which might actually move to the fact that this is effective policy making, not a targeted preference piece. But yeah, we could look within the DHS. Irma.
There are no differences, sex differences in income account. So if there was improvement, you would expect it to be the same because there is no sex discrimination. You have to look at right now or something like that. But going back to our comment about the empowerment, one would maybe you could also look at contraceptive use. Because that might have changed when it's sort of if women feel more independent or feel like they have so both age and first birth and contraceptive use might give you some sense of that.
Yeah, we can look at those. Age of first birth, some sort of age-specific fertility measure or something that captures that. Contraceptives, IPD. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I think it makes sense now because we're in it anyway. The fixed cost is low, so I think adding these measures is easy for us to do. Well, relatively easy. Yeah.
All right, so unfortunately we're out of time.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks a lot. I appreciate it.